who are those who say they are Jews and are not? And what is the synagogue of Hasatan? We might say Satan or the adversary. And how does the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah writings, define such people with such derogatory terminology? Could it be that this is just another one of those greatly misunderstood topics and misused topics within Catholic and Protestant church history? Because both of these large Christian camps in history have used this terminology to claim that all Jews who reject Jesus as the Messiah are simply claim to be Jews but are not, and therefore are of the synagogue of Hasatan. And Martin Luther said even worse. If you can Google search his thesis titled "To the Jews and Their Lies," or just Google search "Jews are Devils Thesis." That's dung. In other words, I guess it's worse to be the dung of a devil than to be actually a devil, according to the way he used that horrible terminology that we don't even find in the scriptures. So is that actually what the New Testament teaches? Well, let's take a look. And what I propose and what I'm going to provide is that the Jewish people in general have been misinformed because the majority in general of Christianity has been misinformed in the last few centuries at least. But now we can go right to the book and read it for ourselves in our own language. So let's go right to the most commonly misunderstood verses on this topic right off the bat in the book of Revelation. Chapter 2, verse 9, Yeshua, aka Jesus, is quoted speaking to the congregation of Smyrna in Revelation chapter 2. He says, "I know your works, tribulation and poverty," physical poverty, "but are rich," talking about being spiritually rich in relationship, of course, with the Most High. "And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Hasatan." Now it uses the Greek word synagogue here to try to imply this is referring to Jewish DNA, because the Greek word can also be translated as church, the church of Hasatan, ecclesia. Now, also, one chapter later, in Revelation chapter 3, and in verse 9, instead of 2:9, it's 3:9, we see a similar wording here, but to the congregation of Philadelphia. It says here, "Indeed, I will make those of the synagogue or church of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but they lie, and indeed I will make them come and worship before your feet." We see a potential repentance here, maybe, as Joseph's 10 brothers who rejected him and wanted him dead, and eventually he was revealed to them, and of course they repented and Joseph forgave them, and they worshiped before his feet, just like his dreams foretold back when he was probably just a teenager. and offended them very much at that time. And he says, anyway, they will come and worship before your feet and to know that I have loved you. So we can see some revelation will be given to them in due time. So we got to be careful. Could this be talking about those with Jewish DNA? Or is it limited to that? Or anyone who rejects the Messiah? Well, let's also remember what Yeshua said after being tortured and being put to death, not just by the Jews, but also the Romans, the Gentiles, both camps, Jew and Gentile, had something to do with this, not just one or the other, and one or the other likes to point the finger at the other. And have you noticed when you point the finger at somebody, usually there's 3 more pointing back at you? Anyway, notice this here. It says in Luke chapter 23, verses 33 and 34, it says, when they came to the place called the Skull, they nailed him to the stake. And they nailed the criminals to the stakes as well. There was one on one side and one on the other side of him. One on the right and one on the left hand, as it says. And Yeshua said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. And then they divided his clothes by throwing dice, or lots, it can say, referring to the prophecy being fulfilled in Psalms chapter 22, and in verse 19 or 18, depending on your translation. Anyway, we see Romans and, of course, Romans were Gentiles, generally speaking, Jews, and not just the Jews. But Yeshua, remember, he also said in the book of Yochanan, that's John, chapter 6 and verse 44, it says, no one, this is quoting Yeshua again, no one can come to me unless the Father draws them to him. So, and I will raise him up in the last day. So, if the Father's not drawing him, I don't want to be a part of judging or condemning anybody, of course, but we have to be really careful and not get too arrogant because, or if, we've been drawn. And it's a matter of due time before others will be drawn too. So, therefore, we should ask, progressing forward here, we should ask, how does the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah writings, define the synagogue of Hasatan, or the adversary? How does it define those who say they are Jews and are not? Well, beginning, and probably one of the clearest sections of text on this topic to answer this question, these couple questions here, is in Romans chapter 2. Early on, it says those who are doers of the word here and not hearers only will be justified. So we see doers of the word. But if we jump down to verse 25 through 29 of Romans chapter 2, it says, for circumcision is indeed of value if you do what the Torah says. I don't think he's being sarcastic here, that circumcision is profitable. It is, in fact, in Romans 3 verses 1 and 2, he says, what advantage do the Jews have? They have the circumcision and the holy oracles. Anyway, so, yeah, it is, he's not abolishing circumcision, as many Christians seem to think in other scriptures as well, which I can gladly explain also at another time, but I don't want to get off on a tangent here. It says, But if you are a transgressor of the Torah, your circumcision has become as uncircumcision. So this is talking about people who are physically circumcised, but they're not even keeping the Torah. They become like they're uncircumcised. This is what it's clearly saying in verse 25. In other words, the physically circumcised Jews, if they're not, this is according to the Brit Hadashah and according to the claims of Hashem, the Holy One, the Most High, is that you can be a physical Jew, but if you're not keeping the Torah, you might be a DNA Jew, but you're technically not a real Jew. You have to be faithfully Torah observant and growing. Not that we're all perfect. We all need mercy and patience and grace. We have this faith chapter in Hebrews chapter 11 where all these faithful ones in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, will be resurrected. They had to have had some grace because they weren't perfect either, but they were faithfully Torah observant, learning and growing and maturing in their walk with the Most High. And this is what is being explained here in Romans here, that obedience to just one mitzvah alone is not good enough. Yeah, you can be keeping the Sabbath perfectly, Shabbat, but the other 9 of the 10 big words and commandments, if you're not doing those, then what good is it? You can't earn your salvation by obedience when you're falling short and you're imperfect, because it says the soul that sins shall die in the scriptures. So that's the curse of the Torah, is the death penalty and other penalties for any sins that you commit. We call them negative commandments in Judaism today. And the positive commandments are these commandments on how to love Him. We see that in the first 4 of the Big Ten, and how to love each other. You can say the 5th one as well, loving your father and mother, is also in relation to our Father of the universe, our parent. And also the last 5 are how to love your neighbor, how to love your brothers, how to love other human beings out there. And the whole Torah are really based upon those 2, loving Him and loving each other. But there's penalties, there's curses for breaking them. Of course, they're mentioned here, and so just keeping one. In Judaism today, in case you haven't noticed, they don't go around forcing circumcision, and you really have to be Torah observant and go through schooling and questioning and make sure you truly are converting in the heart first. But according to the Brit Hadashah writings, the kind of circumcision groups that Paul was dealing with were those who forced circumcision beforehand. As, okay, you want to convert? Okay, we got to start with this. This is what earns your salvation. And if you have that approach and that attitude towards circumcision, well, it's just like Christianity. Say, well, I got Jesus, and now I can just do whatever I want, and I don't have to change. I don't have to keep the Torah. And so we don't want to have that attitude of saying, okay, I'm physically circumcised, or I accept Messiah, and then all of a sudden that's all there is to it, and I'm saved for all eternity. No, He expects change. He expects repentance. He expects Torah observance, as we'll get to as we continue here. But so far in Romans chapter 2, we haven't read anything about rejecting the Messiah as being a non-Jew. So let's continue though. Verse 26, therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous, these are the positive commandments of the Torah, won't his uncircumcision be counted as like he's circumcised? In the right place. As Abraham, as it says here, was physically uncircumcised when he received the covenants, right? And he was circumcised of the heart long before he was circumcised of the flesh. And so this is the attitude that Shaul, aka Paul, is trying to get to here as he explains it further in Romans chapter 4. I'll just quote that real quickly in verses 9 through 12. He says, "For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness." Verse 10, "How then was it accounted?" How was he considered righteous? While he was circumcised, physically, or uncircumcised? He says, not while he was circumcised. He was declared righteous, given the covenant, while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, and it's a sign, a seal of the righteousness that was already there beforehand, that he might be the father of those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also. And the father of circumcision to those not only who are circumcised, but those who walk in the steps of the faith, which our father Abraham had while he was uncircumcised. And what we see through the book of Acts and through the Brit Hadashah writings, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but there was baby steps that the Gentiles had. There was other priority commandments for them to start with. We see in Acts 15 that they're not to be eating blood, any meat that's been strangled, food that has been offered to idols, or sexual immorality. And it doesn't say anything about murder and stealing and lying, of course. A lot of these commandments are obvious, but these were the ones that they were struggling with, that they had to overcome these things before they even moved on to some of the more difficult things like circumcision. And so let the Spirit of the Most High speak to each individual if they're adults. And they can get circumcised if they want, and don't push it on them as some kind of an initiation for eternal salvation. And this is the whole gist. I have a whole video teaching called the Circumcision Schism, where I explain all of Paul's difficult scriptures on circumcision. It's a very thorough and detailed topic I don't want to get into on this. But jumping back in here, we see that Abraham was given his covenant, of course, before he was physically circumcised. This is the point that's being made, that adult male circumcision was not an initiation for conversion, the first thing to start out with and to force upon people as adults. And in the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, chapter, I think it's 20, it's not in my notes, but chapter 20, I think verses 20 through 24-ish, he makes a vow at the temple with sacrifices and offerings to never teach against Moses, the Torah, the written Torah, or the circumcision of children, of course, on the 8th day, which is according to Torah. And so Paul never taught against that. And if he did, yes, he would be contradicting himself and completely going against the Jerusalem conference of referring to some kind of forced circumcision on people, or just saying that it's a-okay, you don't have to do it anymore, and it's all, but, you know, and to be a part of the body of the Messiah for eternity, that there were stages of conversion too. Romans, as I mentioned earlier, Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 2 is very important. He says here, what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the profit of circumcision? He says, much, in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of the Most High. This is talking about the written Torah, the holy writings. So this is where Paul's not slamming Jews and calling them of the synagogue of Satan or anything like that here. If they're Torah observant and striving to keep the Torah the best you can, and if you are, you're truly sincere and you're overcoming your prejudice, eventually the Messiah will be revealed. And the same thing goes the other way. If you believe in the Messiah and you're sincere and you're studying and you willing to be proven wrong and to change when you're proven wrong, eventually you're going to come to Torah. It works both ways. And if you try to have one without the other, you're simply incomplete. And this is what Shaul is teaching here. If we go back to Romans 2, continuing on here in verse 27, I read 26 earlier, he says, "Indeed, the man who is physically uncircumcised but obeys the Torah," he's following the rest of it the best he can, "will stand as a judge on you who have the Brit Milah." This is that circumcision on the 8th day and the written certificate to prove it, "and have Torah written but are violating the Torah." So he's saying there can be uncircumcised people that are much more righteous and closer in relationship to the Most High than physical Jewish DNA who are violating Torah, who are abolishing it in their lifestyles or not observing it. And of course we all are imperfect. We fall short, and this is where we need to come to him for help and repentance and forgiveness and so forth. But we can see that the same goes for all uncircumcised Christians also, as we examine this a little more carefully. That replacement theology came into existence through the Catholic Church and has continued on through much of the Protestant Reformation and even a lot of Protestant theology today. Replacement theology is basically saying the Jews are gone and we are in their place. In other words, they may not admit they're Jews, but essentially replacement theology says, well, I am claiming to be Jewish, but you could still not be. It's a grafting in theology, not a replacement theology, and that's another topic I won't get into. But just, Christians who claim to be Jews, in other words, is what I'm saying, or have replaced the Jews as the same thing, but are not, if they're abolishing Torah and obviously willfully violating it, well, then they're really not. They're not grafted in yet to the degree that they should. And we're all sincere. We've all been misinformed. And so we could be true believers and sincere believers. I'm not trying to judge you out there, okay, or condemn anybody out there. And that's what we need to realize, that the scriptures are not pointing the finger at just one side or the other, that we all got to just see if that shoe fits. And if it does, wear it, okay? If you don't mind that, hope you don't mind that idiom there, modern day idiom. So let me give you some evidence of this in Matisyahu, the book. Matthew, as we say often here, in chapter 7, verses 21 through 23, very common one. It says, "Not everyone who says to me," this is Yeshua quoting him again, "not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but who will?" Here it says, "only those who do what my Father in heaven wants," or does the will of the Father. Verse 22, "On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we expel demons in your name? Didn't we perform many miracles in your name?'" He may still honor our prayers and honor the miracles because we're using his name. But then, verse 23, "I will say to their faces," this is quoting the Complete Jewish Bible translation, "I never knew you. Get away from me, you who practice lawlessness," or Torah-lessness. So this can apply to, say, those who claim as Jesus as the Messiah too, and even doing miracles and wonders in his name. Another very common scripture I'll quote very quickly is also in Matisyahu, Matthew chapter 5, go back a couple chapters here, verses 17 through 19. Yeshua said, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the Torah." Notice how he repeats himself. I have not come to abolish the Torah. Yes, indeed, I tell you that until heaven and earth pass away from the not as much as one yud or one stroke of the Hebrew letters of the Torah will pass, not until everything that must happen has happened. So whatever disobeys, this is quoting him, continuing in verse 19, he says, so whoever disobeys the least of these mitzvot, these are the commandments in the written Torah, which ones are the least to you? You consider the least. He says, those who disobey the least and teach others to do so will be called least in the kingdom. But whoever obeys them and teaches them, faithfully of course, will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So clearly, those who say they are Jews or have replaced the Jews and are not could be those who are clearly going against what Yeshua taught. And he taught Torah, the written one. He did rebuke a lot of the oral being too strict, but not. He still observed a lot of it. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater in any situation, and there's a lot of truth in the oral law, but we have to compare it to the written, compare it to the scriptures, and put it to the test. And don't just have a prejudice against this or that, because maybe we just don't understand, because we haven't been taught it growing up. And we need to research and study and question everything and put everything to the test. Prove all things, but hold fast to what is good. And it says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 5, I think that's around verse 23 somewhere, 22, 24. Anyway, notice Romans chapter 2. Continuing on here, now I read 27, now 28. For the real Jew is not merely Jewish outwardly. True circumcision is not external and physical only. I guess I'll throw that in there as we see in the context of this. He says, on the contrary, the real Jew is one inwardly, and true circumcision is of the heart. Spiritual, not literal, so that his praise comes not from other people, but from the Most High. And this isn't just a New Testament concept. We see this in the Tanakh, 2 times in the written Torah, in Devarim, that's Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16. It says, therefore, this is the Most High quoting him, Moshe writing it down, therefore, circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Yeah. And don't be stiff-necked any longer. Jumping to Devarim chapter 30 and verse 6, it says, then this holy name, the Most High, your Elohim, will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your children, so that you will love the Most High, your Elohim, with all your heart and all your being, and thus you shall live. Now, this wasn't fulfilled until the prophecy of in the Brit Hadashah, prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 33, it says, I'll give you a new spirit, I'll give you a Brit Hadashah, and I'll write the Torah, the commandments, my laws, in your hearts and in your mind. And so Moshe is even prophesying of this coming through this Brit Hadashah. And also Jeremiah. We go back to chapter 4, verse 4. He says, then the Most High, your Elohim, will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your children, so that you will love the Most High, your Elohim, and all your heart, with all of your being, and thus you shall live. Here, even Moshe, and we see Jeremiah the prophet saying the same exact thing and prophesying this Brit Hadashah, which will bring it in on a much larger scale instead of just a few minority individuals that we see in the faith chapter, in the faith book here. Has even listed some of them, not all of them, but in Hebrews chapter 11. So therefore, according to the Brit Hadashah writings, the New Testament, the definition, we can see what is the definition of those who say they are Jews but are not. And also, what is the synagogue of Hasatan, the adversary? Well, as we can see, it may refer to physical DNA Jews, and it may refer to Christians also, who are against the Torah. That's what we've seen so far. Who claim to the salvation covenant as promised to the Jewish people. And if you want that promise, that Brit Hadashah, even that covenant in Jeremiah, we see it in Jeremiah 31 through 33, and then jumping into chapter 32 around verse 19, and even you see it in Ezekiel 2 times. I think it's Ezekiel 11 and Ezekiel 36. A new spirit is needed on the majority level, for so many of us need that help, that extra helper. But obviously, whether you're Jew or you're Christian, whether you're neither of the above, obviously violating or abolishing the written Torah kind of puts you in a dangerous camp. But so far, those who are observing Torah the best we know and the best we can and are fully sincere, well, eventually, let's not throw in the towel or give up, or give up on the Messiah either. And realize that, of course, when the Messiah reveals himself, HaMashiach reveals himself to you and to me, to any of us, personally, on the personal level, we must accept him without prejudice. Some people say, well, he's Jewish? I was never taught that. And others say, oh wow, well, he fulfilled Torah and taught Torah and never spoke anything against it. Well, we've all been misinformed to one degree or another. But with obedience to his written Torah, we can see that it is actually an outward expression of our living faith in him. The most